This program designed, normally we have about a half-hour campaign battle walk that we call it. In that half hour, we have to cover basically about 400 years of modern European American history. Not only obviously the background and lead up to what happens here, the battle itself, and then the aftermath and the significance of this site. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on background today. We really sort of want to get into the nuts and bolts of what happened here 266 years ago. But we'll just start out with a little bit of a background, and I'm going to ask for your guys' help in that a little bit. There's some smart folks out here. Some of you guys probably know this stuff better than I do. Why do we come into conflict? Why is there a battle here at all 266 years ago? What's going on? Any thoughts? They want territory. Yeah? Who wants territory, do you think? Well, yeah, the British, the French in this area, but the Spanish are here in North America too, yeah, trying to acquire territory. The British have territory. What do we call those places? What are those areas? What do we think out of them? Yeah, colonies. How many of them are there? 13, yeah, the 13 original colonies, right, stretch from Maine down to Georgia. About 1.5 million British colonists in those colonies at this period, about 1750. The French have colonies here as well, right? What's one French colony, a big one? Fort Lebeuf, yeah, that's an area, but what's one of the big colonies? Yeah, so Canada, right? They have Canada, which is called New France. French are very original in how they name their colonies. Came from France, New France. They also have Louisiana, right? Named for the most Christian king, Louis the XIV. So we have Quebec and Canada up there. We have New Orleans and Louisiana down here. And then in the middle, we sort of have this no man's land. And this no man's land is really the Ohio Valley. And it's a no man's land between the two European powers, but there's some other people that live there as well. Who might they be? Yeah, the Native American groups, right? So the Lenape or Delaware, the Shawnee, and then a group of Iroquois and various different Indian nations called the Mingo. And so all of them are recent immigrants as well. So where do you think the Delaware Indians used to live? Delaware, yeah, at least along the Delaware River Valley in western New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania. The Shawnee, Shawnee is a Iroquoian word for nomadic. It's a nomadic Indian group that has moved around the East Coast. They used to live in southern New York and northern Pennsylvania. Then they got in a fight with the Iroquois Confederacy, the most powerful Indian group in eastern North America. So they moved south. Then they got in a fight with another Indian group called the Cherokee down south, and by this point they've moved into the Ohio Valley. And then the Mingo are sort of a conglomeration of various Indian tribes. So really, the intent of highlighting all that is to say that the Ohio Valley in the spring of 1754, in the middle of the 18th century, it really is this giant tinderbox. There's just waiting for something to happen, and it's not a coincidence it's going to happen here. What is so important about the Ohio Valley or Western Pennsylvania in general that's going to bring us into conflict here? What's the significant spot?
Pittsburgh.
Yeah, right. Yeah, where the three rivers come together, the site of modern-day Pittsburgh. That key junction of these, 18th century interstates, which is what the waterways are. These 18th century interstates that help facilitate commerce and moving people back and forth. If you control that intersection in the wilderness, you control the entire area. And so, both Britain and France, as we get into the 1750s, come to the realization you have to control that spot of ground. And in the spring of 1754. Both Britain and France are going to send armed bodies of men to the exact same spot with the exact same mission. Britain and France are not at war in the spring of 1754. But if you're not at war and you send two armies to the same spot to do the exact same thing, you think you might get yourself in a little bit of trouble? Yeah, and that trouble is going to actually happen, or at least begin, right here where you're sitting at the end of May 1754. So again, the British are trying to get an army into the Ohio Valley, trying to get down there to modern-day Pittsburgh to build a fort. They put some guy in charge of this mission to build a road to help facilitate that movement. Who's that guy? Yeah, some 22-year-old British kid nobody's ever heard of named George Washington. Washington is placed in charge for various reasons, not going to get into a lot of that, but Washington is building a road. That's his main objective in the spring of 1754. Britain and France are not at war. His mission is to build a military road to connect the British settlements with the interior, with the spot of ground right down there where the British are building a fort called Fort Prince George. In the middle of April, the French are going to sort of ruin their plans. The French, there's about 40 British guys down there building the fort. The French show up down the Allegheny River with well over 1,000 and 18 pieces of artillery. The French kind of roll up on those 40 British guys, and you know, they kind of tell them, hey guys, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here, right? They point a bunch of guns at them, so you guys can either leave or we're going to blow you into smithereens. So the British surrender, basically. They leave, they come back, and so Washington's sort of in no man's land at that point. He's not sure what he's going to do. But he arrives right here, basically where we were sitting, on May 24th, 1754, building his road. And he looks at this meadow that we see here. We have about 1.5 miles, actually 2 distinct meadows. It's called the Great Meadows, 2, plural. One out there near the park entrance that comes in right over here, and a much larger one that basically makes a half moon formation about a little over 1 mile long, right around this hill where the tavern sits today. And he looks at this place. It's a great campsite, right? It's nice and open, so nobody can sneak up on them. Lots of grass. Why would grass be really important to an 18th century army? Yeah, that's what, right? We use animals to move the army. So horses and oxen and cattle. Washington has a herd, about 40 cattle with him to help feed the army, beef on the hoof. And so grass is vitally important. Imagine, and it's hard for us to imagine today, but out here west of the mountains in the 18th century, there is nothing out here but trees. Everywhere you look around are trees, and not small trees like we have today. Great big ones that have been growing forever and have never been cut down. So grass doesn't really grow naturally in a lot of places. Only in naturally occurring meadows does grass grow abundantly. And so how many wagons do you think it would take if you had, you know, 200 horses and oxen and cattle with the army, and you had to feed them by bringing all the food with you? How many wagons do you think it would take? A lot. Yeah, so places like this where grass grows naturally, they can not only graze the animals, but they can cut more to take with them. So very, very important. Washington is camped here on May 27th. He's been here for about 3 days, resting and refitting the army, grazing the animals, when he gets word that the French are nearby. And you know, there's a lead up to this. That Washington's been hearing that the French had sent out a party from Pittsburgh, Fort Duquesne, to come look for him. He's told by his Indian allies they're going to attack him. And on May 27th, he finally gets a report the French are nearby. And so on the evening of May 27th, Washington leaves right here where we're sitting. He's going to travel 7 miles that way to a place called what? What's that place called? Yeah, Jumonville Glen. When on the morning of May 28th, there's an engagement. Now, oftentimes, if you watched our film, or even if you read it in histories, we say about Jumonville, right, it's a he said, she said. We don't know who fired first. What happened? The British say it was the French say it was the British. There's some recent scholarship that's become available, and actually, if you just look at what Washington wrote about the engagement, immediately after the engagement, so on May 28th, his army comes back here, the men that he had with him, the army's camped here, and he sits down and he writes a letter to Governor Dinwiddie. Now, George Washington, we know, good old honest George. George never told a lie, right? We all know that, but he may have embellished from time to time. George writes a letter to Governor Dinwiddie. That letter is 14 paragraphs long. In the first 10 paragraphs, Washington complains about how much he and his officers are getting paid. And in the 11th paragraph, he says, oh, by the way, this thing happened. Yeah, pretty significant thing. So, you know, Washington at that point realizes he's probably in a little bit of trouble. Washington, you know, is going to start at that point to sort of think about, hey, maybe the French aren't going to be too happy about what happened, right? And what happened is the murder, basically, of this French officer, who the French later will claim was simply an emissary. So Washington, right, had gone to the French in 1753, the year before. The French will say that Jumonville was simply doing the same thing. He was coming here to tell the British, hey, this is French territory. You need to live. Jumonville was killed in the engagement, most likely murdered at the end of the engagement by Washington's main Indian ally, and the French are not going to be too happy about that, right? So that incident occurs, again, the morning of May 28th. Washington will come back here and get ready for the next phase of the campaign. And that's something we're going to talk about at our next stop. Does anybody have any questions at all about any of that? Any questions at all? Yes?
You hear most people often say that Half King Tanagrisson was killed Jumonville, and that's accepted. How truthful do we appreciate? Because I've heard other accounts that ignore it.
There are several accounts.
Okay.
Yeah. That comes from 2 different accounts. One French and one from a British deserter who was with Washington there, who later deserts and is captured by the French. So, again, history is, you know, we like to think of history as black and white, and it's written down in a book, and that's the way it is. there's a lot of gray in history. And so what we do is take all these different accounts, and we'll go through some of them today that we have, but we go through the different accounts and try to piece out what our best interpretation of what that is. And so, yeah, there are at least two accounts that point to the Half King, tomahawking Jumonville, washing his hands and his brains. And he tells him first, right, "Thou art not yet dead, my father." Now, he's not just speaking to Jumonville, he's speaking to the French. The Half King does not like the French at all. And we're not going to dive into that too much. You can ask me questions about that if you want. All right, so I'm probably, where are we at on time?
We're done.
Well, you could have told me a couple minutes ago. I was
just
just rambling
finished.
on. Casey's job also today is to keep me on time because as a historian, I like to talk significantly, so she's supposed to do that. But we're going to get up and move in a minute. I just want to point real quick to this picture of George Washington. Is anybody familiar with this portrait? Pretty famous, right? Very first portrait ever painted of George Washington in his life, 1774. It's by Peel. Have it at Washington Lee, the original. So George Washington in 1774 has a painting of himself painted, which was very, very expensive in the 18th century. You might only do it once in your lifetime. And so for that painting, he decided to include everything that was very, very important to him in his life up to that point. And at this point, he's a nice, kind of happy, fat farmer, right? Looks like his vest's about to lose a few buttons. He's doing well. Martha's cooking's pretty good. He married the wealthiest woman in Virginia. So in it, he includes his British military uniform from the French and Indian War as Colonel of the Virginia Regiment, Commander-in-Chief of Virginia Forces. He includes Braddock's sash that Braddock had given to him that's stained with his blood from the Battle of Monongahela. And right down here is a little piece of paper that says Order of March. That's a memento from his service on Forbes' campaign in 1758, when Forbes had allowed him to draft the Order of March for the movement from Fort Ligonier to Fort Duquesne. So 1774, you're going to get a painting of yourself done. You're going to include everything that's really important in your life. What does it all sort of represent? How experienced he is in whose military? The British Army. About 7 months later, Washington will be a delegate to the Continental Congress and be Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. So 6 months before that, Washington is still portraying himself as a British military officer. Just something to think about as we get into it. So, all right, folks, we're going to get up, and again, please try to maintain your social distancing, your distance. We're going to walk up this way and hit up the road, and Casey's going to lead the way, and I'll answer any questions you have along the way. So a little bit of both. So the majority of tribes would have allied one way or the other. The Iroquois Confederacy is interesting in that where it's located in upstate and central New York. The tribes the nations that were recorded. All right, yeah, we'll hold up right here so you guys can. It's a kind of a view out along Indian Run. So there are two streams in the Great Meadow. Indian Run, which we just came over at that little bridge there, and then down there by the fort, there's another stone concrete bridge that crosses Indian Run. And right to just to the right of where the stockade is now, about 50 yards, it makes its juncture with Great Meadow Run. So those are the two streams that go into the meadow. Again, plentiful sources of water. George Washington also writes on May 24th when he arrives here that with nature's assistance, we have been provided entrenchments. So what do you think he's talking about with nature's assistance? Yeah, exactly. So he's saying that if we're attacked, surprise attack by somebody, we're going to be able to fight from these natural trenches, which he's talking about the stream beds. So imagine having your guys stand down in water and try to fight back and defend themselves. But yeah, Washington, again, this is a key spot logistically for his effort. All right, so we just walked a little bit of the Braddock Road. So again, you guys are on the 1755 roadbed cut by General Braddock's army. They came through here towards the end of June 1755. So imagine 1,400 British troops and wagons and horses right along this road. There have been flankers on either side, but that's another year in next week's program, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. But what we do want to talk about is Washington's movement from here, what happens after Jumonville, and then his movements up into the battle on July 3rd. Washington will be here for several weeks after the Jumonville incident. So he decides after he's gone ahead and attacked the French, probably not the best idea in the first place, right? I know we talked about he said, she said. That letter I was telling you about with Washington, that 14 paragraphs, in the 10th paragraph, he says, the Half King and I made a plan to strike the French. So does strike the French sound like we're just going to see what they're up to? Maybe have some croissants in the morning? No, yeah, he went there to attack them. And again, there's been some recent historical evidence, a Native American account of a participant at Jumonville who basically says that George Washington himself fired the first shot. Many of you may have seen in the Smithsonian magazine just last fall, Dr. David Preston wrote an article about that. So again, no real he said, she said on Jumonville. The British went there to attack. George Washington himself may have pulled the first trigger on the engagement. After that incident, Washington realized he's probably in a little bit of trouble with the French, right? They're not going to be too happy about this engagement. And so he decides that prudence is maybe better than kind of charging ahead. And he's going to wait here at the Meadow for about 2 weeks. One, he's going to await resupply and reinforcement. Governor Dinwiddie's a great politician, right? The governor of Virginia. He's been promising him all this stuff, tons of supplies, more reinforcements. Thousands of Indian warriors are headed your way to help you. None of that stuff's ever going to get here, by the way. Some of it will, a couple, reinforcement of men. But Washington's going to wait for those things to get here. And he's also going to await the French response. We're about 60 miles from Pittsburgh, so from Fort Duquesne, where the French are. So that's a pretty good buffer, right? If the French leave Fort Duquesne to come attack him, he's going to know it through his Native American allies and through the Half King and his intelligence, having reconnaissance and intelligence out there. So he's going to be able to find out. So he's going to wait for 2 weeks. During that time, Washington will receive some reinforcements. So he has about 140 men here. That sounds like a grand big army, right? 140 guys. Washington's going to get about 150 more. So the other half of the Virginia regiment will arrive here on June 14th. About that same time, 100 British regulars. His Majesty's Independent Company from South Carolina. There have been British regulars garrisoned in South Carolina. When the governor of South Carolina hears what's going on, Governor Dinwiddie writes to him for help. He sends 100 British regulars north to help out on this campaign. They will arrive on June 14th. And so with that reinforcement, Washington now feels confident to move out of here. No response from the French. Nothing's happened. So we're going to leave the Great Meadows and we're going to continue our mission to the west. And his new mission, originally was to build a road up to modern-day Pittsburgh and build a fort. His new mission is now going to be to go 25 miles due west from here to modern-day Brownsville, Pennsylvania. There, the Ohio Company has a storehouse, and Washington's going to plan is to build a fort there, await these massive reinforcements Governor Dinwiddie has promised him, and then when all of them come, they'll simply sail down the Monongahela River and kick the French out of the fort they're building, Fort Duquesne. So that's the plan. Go 25 miles due west and build a new fort over the mountains. So on June 16th, Washington will leave the Meadow. Now, meanwhile, between June 14th and 2 days later, Washington runs into some problems with his allies. And those allies are actually the British regulars. Captain James Mackay, commanding the regular company, in no way, shape, or form feels that he has to listen to Provincial Lieutenant Colonel George Washington. And so they have a bit of an argument. And Mackay kind of refuses to obey Washington's orders. He sets up a completely different camp than the Virginians in the other Meadow. And they refuse to honor each other's passwords and countersigns. Oh, no. And so Washington finally decides on June 16th, you know what? You guys just stay here. I'm going. You guys stay here and garrison the Great Meadows. So the 100 British regulars will stay here. The 300 or so men of the Virginia Regiment on June 16th will leave the Meadow. And they'll go out the far end of the Meadow. So actually that trail we walked up when we started away from the benches, that's about where we think Washington's road came into the Meadow. So we're on the Braddock Road right now. Braddock on his campaign wanted to avoid this giant open area. Why do you think he wanted to do that? Trying to avoid an ambush. And so his road goes to the side of the Meadow. Washington's road actually came down off the hill behind us and came down almost probably about the way we walked. Down into the Meadow past the benches and then out the other side. No archaeological evidence has ever been found of that road. So we don't know exactly where it went. We are going to walk what we think is the other portion of it here in just a little bit out to the other end of the Meadow. But so his Meadow came down and through. So on June 16th, the Virginians begin to leave. Washington will go up and over Chestnut Ridge, just north of modern-day Uniontown, to a place called Mount Braddock today, known as Gist's Plantation. In 1754, Christopher Gist, the Ohio Company guide, has a settlement there. And Washington's going to sort of set up shop in his headquarters there, but he's going to push working parties all the way out. They will actually build the road, work on the road, all the way to modern-day Brownsville, so 25 miles to the west. However, by the end of June, Washington's finally going to receive intelligence that the French are in fact coming. The French are, in fact, not very happy with him. They've been reinforced. Washington is told there's well over 1,000 French and Indians now at Fort Duquesne. And guess what? Oh, by the way, who's the new French commander? The murdered guy's brother. Yeah, Captain de Villiers is the new French commander. Jumonville is his full brother. They're brothers. Oftentimes it's been sort of shown that they were half brothers. They're not. French names are very, very confusing, right? So we have Ensign Joseph Colon de Villiers de Jumonville and Captain Louis Joseph de Villiers. So de Villiers is the family name. They are full brothers. So that guy's not too happy, right? He's probably going to want a little revenge for his brother's murder. And on June 29th, Washington will finally receive intelligence that the French are in fact coming after him. So he's actually, again, at Gis, just north of modern-day Uniontown, about 13 miles away. He has working parties all the way out to modern-day Brownsville. And so Washington at that point will recall his army. And we're going to just reference Major Adam Stephen, Washington's third in command here, writes about the intelligence they get on June 29th. June 29th, we received certain intelligence that the French were reinforced with 300 white men and the same number of Indians, and that they intend to march immediately to attack us. Whereupon Colonel Washington called a council of war, wherein it was resolved to send an express to hasten the independents to join us. So they thought it probably a good idea to send a word to the British regulars, hey, you guys better come. We're going to need you. You guys better come forward. So a messenger sent over the mountains to the Great Meadow, and the independents are going to march over the mountain to help the Virginians. In the meantime, we should set about fortifying ourselves, as well as the time would permit, and there await the arrival of their working parties. So Washington initially decides to build a fort over the mountain at Gis Plantation. And that's going to be called the Hog Pen Fort. Now, I got to tell you, as a park ranger, it would be pretty cool to work at Hog Pen Fort National Battlefield. But that's not going to happen. But he decides to build a fort there. So the men are engaged in building fortifications. However, that night, on the evening of June 29th, the independent company will arrive, Captain McKay, their commander, and Washington again holds a council of war. And he says, all right, guys, and this is a common thing in the 18th century. This is not just because Washington is 22 years old and young and inexperienced. He'll do it throughout his entire time as commander of the Continental Army. The council of war is to get the opinion of the officers, and then the commander makes a decision. He holds a council of war, and everybody and their brother, it's unanimous, says, you know what, let's get out of here. The game is up. The French, they were heavily outnumbered. We can't really accomplish our mission. They're not too happy. They're coming after us. Let's head out. So the initial decision is to retreat back here to the Great Meadows. And also they add, well, let's get back to the Great Meadows and see what the situation looks like. Basically, let's see if the French follow us. And then we'll retreat all the way back to Virginia. That's going to be the plan. To come back up over the mountain and go back to, at least stay here for a little while, then maybe go back to Virginia. So I'm just going to read a little bit from George Washington's journal. He lists the reasons why they would have retreated. And he says the reasons for doing so were weighty. There was a reinforcement hourly expected. We learned from French deserters, so the French are going to get more men. We knew that 2 of our men had deserted to them and acquainted the enemy of our starving condition and our numbers and situation. We had wanted bread and meat for 6 days already. So they have no meat or flour or bread at this point for almost a week. We had only about 25 head of live cattle, the most of them milk cows, to depend upon for 400 men, and about 1 quart of salt to use with our meat. So what's the problem with not having any salt? Yeah, and you have fresh meat. Yeah, you can't preserve it. So Washington's men are in a bad way, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get out to the meadow and their arrival back here. But the situation's a little dire. So on June 29th, again, we're just a couple of days before the battle, Washington makes the decision, you know what, this campaign is over. Can no longer accomplish my mission. We are going back to at least the Great Meadows and possibly all the way back to Virginia. All right? All right, we're going to head out to our next spot, which is just up around the corner. We'll head out into the meadow. We'll talk about the arrival back here at the Great Meadows and the decisions Washington makes at that point. All right, you can follow us. Washington's camp, we don't know exactly. We've done a bunch of archaeology to try to find them. There's some telltale signs here and there. Washington's camp was, we think, probably most likely right in this area behind it. Now, not all the Virginians have tents. The independents, the British regulars, we think were in the field basically over there, all the way across, over the stockade. We haven't been able to locate them specifically. All right, so June 29th, the decision is made to retreat. Now, what Washington had done throughout the last part of June, again, he's hourly expecting reinforcements and resupplies. So the Army had completely moved up and over Chestnut Ridge and down. Washington, when the Army gets over the mountain, and again, it's carrying all its supplies, the 100-pound iron swivel guns, all the ammunition, the food. They get over the mountain. Washington decides to send most of the horses back to the Great Meadows here to try to meet the supplies that are supposed to be coming. He figures if there's more horses, they can move stuff forward much faster. So Washington sends all the horses up and over the mountain and back. So on June 29th, when Washington makes the decision to retreat, all the horses are gone.
Oh.
So who do you think gets to carry all the government stores and food and ammunition back up over the mountain? Yeah, the individual soldiers. So let's just talk about these guys here for a minute. You know, the independent company aside, Washington's 300 Virginians had left home in early April. They had joined the Army. They had been promised various things for joining, like a uniform and a daily ration. Most of them would never receive those things. So for the most part, these guys are out here in their civilian clothing they had left home in 3 months before. Many of them don't have tents. Many of them don't even have blankets. So by this point, after living, imagine going on a 3-month camping trip with only what you have on right now. That's what most of these guys did. The effects of exposure have started to take hold. Let's talk about the rations. The 18th century military ration does not really have enough calories for just the normal day-to-day life. So imagine doing manual labor in the woods, building a road, marching all this way, exposure is taking its effect. You went up and over a mountain, and now you have to carry all your stuff, including artillery, chests of ammunition, barrels of flour and food, back up over the mountain. Imagine what these guys might have looked like. And so not only that, the regular ration doesn't have enough calories. As we heard from Major Stevens' account there, and Washington's, that they are on basically what we call starvation rations. They have very little flour, only this fresh beef with no salt. And everybody likes a good steak, or most people do, right, from time to time. Imagine eating it, just fresh meat cut right off the cow, not 23-day, prime aged, New York strips, no salt, no seasoning. It's not that great for you, especially after a while. And so these guys are in really, really rough shape. Think about their psychological makeup. For the most part, many of these guys had never left home before, had never left coastal Virginia. We tend to think of these guys as like frontiersmen, frontier types, outdoorsy guys. Most of them were out of work laborers from Tidewater, Virginia, from places like Williamsburg and Fredericksburg and Alexandria. They had never even been anywhere near the wilderness, let alone come out here. And anybody ever see the movie A Million Ways to Die in the West? Kind of a funny movie, but it's true. Almost anything out here could kill you. And so these guys are, think about their psychological makeup. And now you're told this massive force of French and Indians are after you. So think about what these guys are going through and what they're thinking about as they arrive back here on July 1st. Basically, the Army limped into this meadow on its retreat on July 1st, 1754. And on the afternoon of July 1st, about 3 o'clock. Washington, this 22-year-old officer, sort of looks around, and he's got a decision to make, right? These guys, if he's gonna, it's obviously in a bad way, but are we gonna continue the retreat? And he looks around at his men, and he's gonna have to make a decision. So I'm gonna read from Major Adam Stevens' account again. July 1st, we arrived very much fatigued at the Meadows, and had continued our retreat, but for want of horses and conveyances to carry our ammunition. Our men had been 8 days without bread, and instead of a large convoy, instead of large reinforcements or supplies, which we had long expected, there arrived only a few bags of flour. They were so harassed with working on the fortifications at Gis and with marching that they were not able to draw the swivel. So the men are basically not able to carry the stuff anymore. They sort of collapsed down here in the meadow. Major Stephen writes, it was thought it most advisable to fortify ourselves in the best manner possible and await our convoy and reinforcements which we daily expected. So Washington makes the decision. Again, looking around at his guys, the decision he has to make is, can I continue the retreat in the amount of time, or are the French and Indians going to catch us? So what he would rather do is be caught in a defensive position that he has a little bit of time to prepare than out on the road in the wilderness with the army strung out in the woods. And so on July 1st, Washington makes the decision. We're going to stand and fight. and we're going to build the fortifications that we're going to fight from. So when people come here and they think about fort necessity, they generally think about the wooden part, right? That wooden stockade, they think that is fort necessity. And Washington, again, had built that after the Jumonville incident, just in the very few days after Jumonville. And he builds it, at the time he has 130 guys, and he uses it mostly as, the cabin is a supply point, right? He's going to be here those 2 weeks. He puts the supplies in the cabin, and then he puts a fence around the supplies. Why does he put a fence around his supplies, do you think? Who's he trying to keep out? Friends, animals? His own guys, yeah. So it is a rudimentary defense. He writes to his younger brother Jack, John Augustine, on May 31st, and also to Governor Dinwiddie on June 3rd, that I built this redoubt, this stockade. What he actually builds is militarily a circular redoubt. But I built this stockade with my small numbers. I shall not fear the attack of 500 men. Did you guys want to fight 500 men from that little stockade? A little hyperbole, I think, there from this young kid. But yeah, he's trying to keep his own men out of his supplies. That's the main reason for the fence around the cabin. But when he gets back here on July 1st, Washington has his 400-man army, 100 British regulars and 300 Virginians. Is that round little stockade going to suffice for that? No. So he decides to build, again, straight out of a military textbook, a redoubt. It's a semi-rectangular redoubt, basically 2 arrowhead-shaped walls. Those walls are called fléchés. They come, again, straight out of an 18th century military engineering manual. And Washington actually builds these walls, and they don't look like much today, those low grassy mounds. Those just, people, I know they were shorter in the 18th century, but they weren't that short. Those low grassy mounds just basically represent where the earthworks were. From this angle, you would have seen a 4-foot-high earthen and log wall. On the other side of that wall was a 2-foot ditch, so that the men standing on the other side of the wall had about 6 feet of cover to stand behind. So again, much more substantial than what you see there today. And Washington actually builds it exactly for how many men that he had. So in that military manual, the engineering manual, it would tell him that each soldier standing in a rank needed 2 feet to operate and maneuver his musket, to load and fire. In a defensive position, the British Army in the 18th century, they stand in 2 ranks. So if they were standing in a field in linear formations fighting, it's 3 ranks. If we're fighting from behind a wall, it's 2 ranks. So 1 man behind the other. So if you have 400 men, you only need frontage for 200 of them. And so if you need 2 feet per man, how many feet is that? Well, I'm a historian, I'll do math. But 400 feet. If you go out and actually measure those earthworks, they're almost exactly 400 feet. So the idea that there's this young, dumb, naive kid that really doesn't know what he's doing, to a certain extent does, unlike his trenches on the day of the battle, really doesn't hold water. Washington builds something right out of a military engineering manual. Now, do we know specifically Washington actually built it? No. There's no contemporary account except Major Stevens, I'm going to read in a minute, for what they did. So really the only thing that we know about how they built these, Major Stevens writes that after they arrived back here, the decision was made to fortify ourselves. We set about clearing the woods nearest to us and carrying in the logs to raise a breastwork and enlarge the fort. Breastwork, again, breast high, about 4 feet or so. It's generally how we've gotten the height of the earthworks. Now we also know from archaeology, 1953 archaeology here, J.C. Harrington, Chief Archaeologist of the Park Service, determined that there was probably a 2-foot ditch on the interior, a 2-foot ditch on the exterior. The earth was piled up in the middle, probably about to the height of 4 feet, and then the logs were used throughout to reinforce, to provide cover on top. So again, a pretty substantial fortification, much more than what you see there today. And these are field fortifications. Oftentimes people come here and they hear fort necessity. They're very confused about what they're going to find, right? They expect to find this large castle-like structure. These are not designed for any great period of time. We're not guarding any important place. These are field fortifications. Washington built these simply, it's very aptly named, right? Fort necessity. He built these to fight from behind on the day of the battle. Wasn't planning on using them maybe ever again. And so that's what he builds here. But it was a fairly substantial fortification. We'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about the French. All right? Is it time to go? 22 seconds. Oh man, it's unprecedented. All right, so we're going to head out this way. We'll actually take in the French view. So Casey, if you want to just lead us out. So this is a new view you wouldn't have probably got if you were here before. We actually just cut this trail 2 days ago.
Oh.
Specifically for this walk, but it is a trail we're going to try and open up What we're going to try eventually to do is actually connect this end of the meadow, probably the far end down here, with Braddock's Road. So there's a really nice section, about a mile or so section of Braddock's Road. It kind of comes off this ridge and continues out along there. Obviously we cut off it over here. It continues out along, and that's really, Washington's Road would have met up with it, just a couple hundred yards that way. This is the way the French came in. So we're going to try to connect this trail together. So. All right, everybody doing all right?
Yep.
Good. All right, so again, new perspective sort of the fort. We have the perspective of the French when they arrived here on the morning of July 3rd, 1754. And the French, again, Washington is told, right, they've been heavily reinforced. They're after them, and that is true. Now, heavily reinforced, again, George Washington never told a lie, but he may have embellished from time to time. He writes he was attacked by over 1,000 of the French and Indians. Not quite accurate. It's really annoying. We actually don't know how many French and Indians are here. None of the French accounts actually state specifically that, yes, there were 732 guys. We have some best guesses. There are about 4 different accounts of the numbers, and so the best guess is about 500 French and about 200 of their American Indian allies. Most of those American Indian allies are not from here, here in the Ohio Valley. They have come with actually Captain de Villiers from Canada. Actually, we have 6 nations represented, from really Vermont and the Abenaki, the St. Lawrence River Valley, to the Huron and Ottawa, even some Nipissings from as far as the shores of Lake Michigan are here for this battle. So the French, Captain de Villiers has actually on his way to the Illinois country. So modern day Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, that is a French colony at this point as well. De Villiers had left Montreal and is headed to the Illinois country with 130 of these Canadian Indians to reinforce what's going on in the Illinois. When he arrives at Fort Duquesne on June 26th, and he learns that of what's been going on. So obviously there has been combat at the end of May at Jumonville on May 28th. De Villiers' brother had been killed. Ensign Jumonville had been killed in that engagement. And so Captain de Villiers, on his arrival, basically says to Captain Contrecoeur, the French commander, who was putting together an expedition at that time to go and attack the British. And de Villiers says, hey, I'd love to obviously command this expedition. Captain de Villiers, and I know the ranks in the New France military structure are a little bit deceiving, because we generally think of somebody like Jumonville, who's an ensign, which is a second lieutenant, or someone like de Villiers, who's a captain. Captain is the highest rank in the French military structure in North America. De Villiers has been in the Army at this point for over 25 years. He's been in the Army since he was 12. He's highly experienced. He's fought in numerous wars, especially out west in modern-day Wisconsin near Green Bay. The French fight a series of wars against the Fox Nation. There's actually, because the de Villiers family, if you ever get a chance to read up on them, very, very interesting. A father and 6 brothers. Of the 7 of them, only 1 will live basically to retirement age. The other 6 will die in the service of New France in various ways. Jumonville, obviously, here at Jumonville. De Villiers, who's here, the commander of the French force, will die in 1757 of smallpox. So, again, de Villiers had arrived. He takes over. He says that Contrecoeur is putting together this 500-man French force, mostly French and Canadian militia. Now, again, there aren't that many French regulars. There's only maybe about 50 of them, we think, here. The rest of the 500 French-Canadian militia, and then again about 200 Native American warriors. So again, Captain de Villiers, again, captain, a very experienced guy, has been in the Army a long time, is going to take command of this expedition. They will leave Fort Duquesne on June 28th. So again, Pittsburgh's about 60 miles away, and we were chatting about this on the way over. If you were the French, how would you think, if you kind of know the British are out there somewhere, but you're not really sure where, how would you go about finding them? Smoke? Okay, maybe? Scouts? Yeah, you want to send out some reconnaissance, right? Try to find where these guys are. What had the British been doing?
Building a road.
Building a road. So if you wanted to find where the British went, what might be the easiest way to do that?
Follow the road.
Follow the yellow brick road, right? Yeah, so the French are actually going to sail up the Monongahela from Pittsburgh, Fort Duquesne, right to where the British had intended to build a fort at modern-day Brownsville, the Ohio Company storehouse. They stop there, they get out of their bateau and canoes, they get on land, and they just simply follow the road that Washington had built. So how nice of that was George Washington to build the enemy a road to get in here and come for the battle. They'll follow the road for several days. Basically, he stops at the storehouse at Brownsville. They stop at Gist Plantation. They then stop at Jumonville. De Villiers would note in his journal that there he found remains. There were 4 bodies visible on the surface. We know from another account, a French Marine and enlisted man called JCB or Charles Bonin, that there were French heads on spikes at Jumonville. He buries the 4 bodies. He doesn't actually mention if any of them were his brother. If you found your brother's body and you buried it, would you write that down? Probably. He doesn't do that, so none of the bodies were probably Jumonville. They hold a little bit of a mass, and then de Villiers gives this sort of rearing speech to the Indians. Most of the Indians, especially the ones from Canada, these American Indian warriors, at this point they're about ready to go home. They're ready to turn back. The farther and farther away they get from the river, they're not too sure about this thing. And de Villiers at Jumonville, basically standing over the place where his brother was murdered, has to sort of give him the Newt Rockne win one for the Gipper speech. We got to go out there, and we got to get the British. And he'll do that, and most of the American Indian warriors will come along with him. So they'll arrive here on the morning of July 1st, and we know from Washington's writing it's about 11 a.m. But we're going to just read from Captain de Villiers' report about their arrival here at the Great Meadows. So he says, I sent out scouts who were to go close to the camp, and 20 more to support them, and advanced myself in order. What does that mean by order, do you think? Any thoughts? Yeah, so he's actually going to organize himself into basically almost a linear fighting formation. We'll talk about that in a minute. When some of my people returned to tell me that we were discovered, and that the English approached in order of battle to attack us. So what I'm going to ask Casey to do, if you would please, you have our other little roll out there. We're going to take a look at the gripping painting that we had commissioned in 2004 for our 250th anniversary. But this is our charming field print. And if you would, I'll take old GW there if you want to take that around and show it to everybody while I'm talking. But this is what we think the exact image the French would have had from basically the vantage point we're at right now, looking towards the fort. This is what they would have seen. You would have seen 400 British soldiers, 100 British regulars in line in linear formation, advancing down the meadow towards the French. Behind them, the several companies of the Virginia Regiment in linear formation, advancing down the meadow. So it's often said, if you read a history of this battle, it said, well, George Washington, he was this young kid, dumb, he didn't know what he was doing. He thought they were going to fight in the open, in the middle of the meadow. I think to a certain extent Washington thought that because he saw the French line up in battle formation in the meadow. And de Villiers does that for several reasons. They had been stretched out along the road, spread out on the march. When de Villiers, when they finally come into the open, and again, we were talking about this on the walk over, right? This is an impenetrable wilderness. It is, it's hard for us to imagine today. We think of this meadow sort of as an oasis of grass in a desert of trees. Everywhere else around here is really, really thick forest. And so it's very easy to get disorganized, to get confused, to not know where you're going. De Villiers was actually about 200 yards that way earlier when he thought he was at the English fort. They sort of like pop out and they look around and like, nope, no fort. They keep going down the road a little ways, and so they do this again. So de Villiers gets his men out into the open, he organizes them, especially the French regulars and the Canadians, and then he basically says, all right, this group, you go there. This group, you go there. This group, you go there. So he organizes them in the meadow. And Washington sees that taking place. Again, he had scouting parties and he had sentinels out pulling guard duty, basically alerting him of the French presence. When they indicate the French arrival, actually about 9 a.m., they get word the French are nearby. And so Washington has placed his men under arms. Right, when the French come out into this point of the meadow, again about 400 yards distant from the stockade, Washington sees them lining up. He decides to line up his own men in linear formation. Yes. Time's up. All right, we're just going to read one more real quick portion before we head off towards the fort. So de Villiers says, again, I put my troops in order of battle in a manner suited to woods fighting. So again, he's breaking them up, sending them in very specific ways. And I gave order to my troops to advance towards the side from which I apprehended an attack. So he apprehends the British are going to come that way. He sees them. As we were not acquainted with the ground, we presented our flank to the fort, whence they began cannonading us. So de Villiers' men come out into the woodline, from the woodline basically, behind you in linear formation. So he says, I presented my flank, my side, to the fort. when they began cannonading us. So the British have 2 swivel guns that they've mounted for the battle. Only one of which is aimed this way. So basically they're now going to start firing golf balls, half-pound iron shot golf balls at the French ranks. I perceived almost at the same time to the right the English coming towards us in order of battle. The Indians, and we also, set up the cry and advanced to meet them. But they gave us no time to make our discharge. They filed off and withdrew into an entrenchment which lay next to their fort. We then set ourselves about investing the fort. It was advantageously enough situated in a meadow, the wood of which was within musket shot, and we came as close to them as possible. So again, de Villiers, the French come out into the meadow in order of battle. The English are advancing towards them, just like that image that Casey showed you. As the French perceive, as de Villiers perceives the British moving towards him, he decides very quickly, again, 25-year veteran of wilderness combat, we are not going to fight in this open field. We're going to disperse. He breaks his men off in a manner best suited to woods fighting. That means that the French are going to go that way, into the wood line. His Native American Indian warriors are going to go that way. Basically, now attempting to completely surround the British fortification over here. All right, let's head back towards the fort, and we'll stop. We'll finish our program up over there, talking about the battle itself. Casey, you want to lead us back? Max, let's go back.
Yeah, honestly, if I'd get a hat from
A few more coming. We'll give him a second. We were just chatting there. There was a question about really the dynamics at play in the Ohio Valley, and I sort of talked about earlier. You know, George Washington is often sort of lampooned and faulted for what happens here. Washington actually does a pretty good job. And Washington is actually pretty well prepared to lead this expedition. Actually, is he actually the leader at the very beginning?
No.
No, yeah, he's actually second in command. Colonel Joshua Fry is placed in command of the regiment on May 31st, unfortunately for him. And in Washington, he dies. He falls from his horse. We don't know exactly what the cause of death was, but he falls off and dies. So if we got any Pittsburgh Steelers fans here, George Washington, to quote Mike Tomlin, was the next man up. You know, he's in charge whether he likes it or not. He's actually pretty well prepared to do that, though. He's led expeditions into the frontier before. What was George Washington's first job?
Surveyor.
Yeah, he's familiar with the frontier. He had gone to Fort Le Boeuf the year before as a messenger to the French. So he's pretty well prepared to lead this. He actually, you know, with his position in society, Washington is not from the upper class of Virginia. He's sort of from a middling class, but for him to sort of command and be in charge of what he perceives as his social inferiors, it's not a big deal for him. He's comfortable doing that. One thing he is not prepared to do in any way, shape, or form is the diplomacy of the frontier. Everybody out here, and we were talking about the Native American group specifically, everybody out here has an agenda. The French, the British, and each individual American Indian group. Everybody's trying to get something. And George Washington, to a certain extent at 22, is not really prepared to deal with that. He doesn't understand, he's a little naive, right? So when the Half-King tells him something, Washington's going to take it at face value. And that, he doesn't quite understand that the Half-King has a real, you know, there's a main reason he's trying to get the British and the French to fight. And that's because if the French come in here with their Canadian, American Indian groups and set up shop, one, the Half-King's out of a job, but there's also some other dynamics going on with the native groups in the Ohio Valley that they really, it's a multicultural community to a certain extent that has established its own identity. They don't really necessarily want anything to do with the British, the French, or the French allied Indians besides trade. And so that dynamic plays into what's going to happen. All right, so we talked about it before. July 1st, Washington's army arrives back here. He begins construction on the defenses of Fort Necessity, those grassy mounds. You see them down there today. He basically builds a semi-rectangular redoubt. The French would arrive about 11 a.m. Washington, as we saw in our image there, advances down the meadow in linear formation. So imagine just stretched out across, just on the other side of the stockade and the redoubt, the earthworks. Imagine 400 British soldiers stretched across that meadow, advancing on the French. And again, we talked about it earlier. Is it a day like today, 266 years ago? Nice, bright, sunny day? No, it actually is raining. It had been raining for several weeks, really, significantly, off and on. It rains throughout the day of the battle. The day opens really sort of misty and drizzling a little bit. So it is a very sort of wet day. But the British will advance down the meadow, and we talked about it out there. The French will disperse into the woodline. De Villiers basically sends his American Indian allies across Great Meadow Run, so basically just to the right of the flag that you see there, to surround the meadow. Where you see those white signs out there around the meadow, that actually marks the tree line, where we believe through a pollen study we did, the 18th century tree line would have been. So the American Indians surround the meadow all the way around. Basically, De Villiers wants to give them, and he even writes in his report, the illusion that they're completely surrounded. The French will take up a main position, sort of a half-moon formation around the stockade. That position goes basically from right here where we're sitting, just beyond us, to this white sign behind us, all the way around through these trees to another white sign we walked by earlier. So about 100-yard position or so, maybe a little more, about 60 to 80 yards from the stockade. Why is that 60 to 80 yards distance significant?
Musket range.
Yeah, that's the effective range of these flintlock smoothbore weapons. So De Villiers even writes in his report that I think I read it when we were out there, that we're within musket shot of the fort. So people will always ask us here, well, yeah, again, George Washington was this young, dumb, stupid kid. Why didn't they cut down the trees? Why didn't they clear the tree line? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, those trees are huge. So, you have a tree, maybe 6, 7, 8 feet in diameter, which some of them were. The largest white oak ever recorded, was cut down in 1931 in West Virginia. It was 10 feet in diameter. Had been growing since probably about 1400. So those are the types of trees that are here. So imagine exhausted men. We talked about the condition of these men. They don't have chainsaws, right? They have an axe. And then you have a giant tree. Is that easy to cut down? No. And George Washington also understands math a little bit. Again, I'm a historian, not a mathematician. How many French and Indians hide behind this tree standing up? 1 or 2? You cut it down, now how many hide behind it? A whole lot more. Washington understands that. He also knows where the French and Indians are going to fight from. The way he constructed his defenses, the largest section of the earthworks, the 2 largest angles of the fortification, face the 2 sections of the tree line that come the closest to the fort. So those 2 sections, these 2 sort of, this half-moon formation we're talking about the French, those 2 sections face that way. Washington knows where they're going to fight from. The 2 artillery pieces he places, the 2 swivel guns. One is on this wall, right where you see that one right there. The other one is on the wall just to the left of the flag. Again, facing those sections of the tree line. So battle will be joined, again, about 11 a.m. After the French and Indian force takes to the wood line, Washington realizes pretty quickly that, hey, they're not fighting in the meadow. We got to get back. And so the British will retire into their earthworks. Actually, Washington's second in command, Lieutenant Colonel George Meadow, realizes a lot sooner than Washington. He'd actually be court-martialed after the battle because when he sees the French and Indians running into the woods, he doesn't wait for anybody to give him an order. He says, I'm out of here. And he takes off with his 2 companies on the left-hand side of the line. They book it back to the earthworks. And Washington will have him court-martialed after the battle. So the battle is joined, again, about 11 a.m. And it's going to be an all-day fight from 11 a.m. when the French arrive to about 8 p.m. that night. And I'll read a couple sections that talks about the battle and what goes on. We'll start out with Colonel Washington. They then advanced. Excuse me. This is from Washington McKay's official report of the battle that goes to Governor Dinwiddie's, then sent on to London. The 3rd of this instant July, about 9 o'clock, we received intelligence that the French, having been reinforced with 700 recruits, had left Monongahela, basically Redstone, were in full march with 900 men to attack us. Upon this, as our numbers were so unequal, our whole force not exceeding 300 men, and George Washington never told a lie, he may have exaggerated, we prepared for our defense in the best manner we could, by throwing up a small entrenchment, which we had not time to perfect, before our sentinel gave notice about 11 o'clock of their approach. It says that they then advanced in a very irregular manner. Again, Captain de Villiers distributes the men into the woods in a manner suiting woodland combat. They advanced in a very irregular manner to another point of woods about 60 yards off, and from thence made a second discharge. Upon which, finding they had no intention of attacking us in the open field, we retired to our trenches. So Washington waited till they got within about 60 yards and were running into the woods around the flank to retire to our trenches. And that's what we talked about. Meadow made the decision a little earlier. We retired to our trenches and still reserved our fire, as we expected from their great superiority of numbers, that they would endeavor to force our trenches, but finding they did not seem to intend this neither, we gave the order to fire, which was done with great alacrity and undauntedness. Washington says they then, from every little rising, tree, stump, stone, and bush, kept up a constant scalding fire upon us, which we returned in the best manner we could till late in the afternoon, when there fell the most tremendous rain that could be conceived, filled our trenches with water, wet not only the ammunition in our cartouche boxes and firelocks, but that which was in a small temporary stockade in the middle of this entrenchment called Fort Necessity, and erected for the sole purpose of its security, the powder security. So Washington, that last part, is writing actually near the end of his life in 1787. That's a sort of autobiography that Washington pens of what happened. He says, really, some of the hardest rain I saw in my entire life fell for 2 hours in the middle of the day. And so I would maintain that Washington actually probably would have at least won this engagement, would have been able to sustain himself long enough for the French to leave had it not rained. Rain is going to be the deciding factor. Washington and his men are in their trenches. They're getting all wet. Again, about 2 p.m., 3 p.m., it drenched. Imagine just the heaviest torrential downpour you've ever seen for an hour or two. This is a low-lying, sort of marshy, wet, natural meadow to begin with. You dug down 2 feet into the ground. What do you think happens when they have torrential rain? The water comes up. Several other participants, Private John Shaw writes about it as well. Barrels and boxes, bodies are floating about to a certain extent. It's very, very wet, very muddy. The weapons themselves, the muskets get wet. The ammunition in the cartridge boxes get wet. So these are muzzle-loading weapons, right? So that means the cartridge, the powder, and the ball go in the barrel. And if you try to fire it, right, it doesn't come out. How do you think you have to remove it? It's got to come back out the barrel, right? To do that, you have to have a thing called a worm or a screw to pull that cartridge back out. And Major Adam Steeman would write that amongst the entire army, out of the 400 men here, they have 2 screws to try to clear their weapons. So it's not that, yeah, Washington has a whole cabin that full of ammunition that he writes about, but the men, the weapons themselves are filed, and to clear that, they have to have that tool. Now, if you were standing in a great big line waiting for that tool to come around, and there's people dead and dying, people around you, Washington suffers 30 killed outright down there in the middle of the stockade, Redoubt. So it's pretty miserable. You're all wet. People are dying. It's not looking so good, right? The end's probably pretty near. Are you going to go out sober? No. About half of Washington's men made the same decision. So there's a cabin that has a whole bunch of rum in it. The British Army issues a daily rum ration in the 18th century. They also have rum as a trade item for the Indians. And so as those men are sort of standing around down there and they can't shoot back and life's pretty miserable, Major Adam Steeman writes about half the men broke into the rum supply and got falling down drunk. So by about 8 p.m., things are not looking good for our friend GW, right? So Major Adam Steeman here writes of the plight of the garrison. We had received no intelligence of the approach of our convoys and reinforcements. We had only a couple of bags of flour and a little bacon left for support of the 300 men we had left. By the continued rains and water in the trenches, and most of our arms were out of order, we had only a couple of screws. So those are the 2 screws or worms we talked about in the whole regiment to clean them. But what was still worse, it was no sooner dark than 1/2 of our men got drunk. So Washington says, we continued this unequal fight, with an enemy sheltered behind the trees, ourselves without shelter, in trenches full of water, and a settled rain, and the enemy galling us on all sides incessantly from the woods, till 8 o'clock at night, when the French called to parley. From the great improbability that such a vastly superior force, and possessed of such an advantage, would offer a parley first, we suspected a deceit, and therefore refused to consent that they should come among us, on which they desired us to send an officer to them and engage their parole for his safety. So again, about 8 p.m., Captain de Villiers, actually probably Captain Lemercier, the second in command, would have walked to the edge of the wood line, probably not too far from where we're sitting right now, and would have called out to the fort, do you want to parley? And Washington says, I'm a little bit confused, right? The French are having much better this engagement. They're probably all nice and cozy and dry in the woods, right? So why would they want to negotiate? And he's confused, and eventually he's going to send out officers to negotiate. And why would the French do that, do you think? Why would they offer to negotiate with the British? Why wouldn't they just kill all the British in the middle of the meadow?
Maybe look better to the Indians?
Look better to the Indians? Sure, yeah, maybe. Good. Yeah, that's a great point, right? So Captain de Villiers is very sensitive and is actually outlined in his instructions from Captain Contrecoeur. Britain and France are not at war. De Villiers had come here to avenge his brother's death and to sort of bloody the English a little bit. But do you think it would have caused an international incident had they slaughtered 400 British soldiers in the middle of the Meadow? Yeah. Taking prisoners of war is a gray area if you're not actually at war. The other thing is that De Villiers is a pretty good poker player. He's actually going to bluff Washington. Washington thinks the French are in this awesome position. They've got this nice high ground. They're nice and cozy and dry. Not so. De Villiers has his own problems. And those problems are that actually during the day, during the course of the battle, his men had fired all their ammunition. The French, again, Washington has this whole storehouse of stuff down there. The French had left Fort Duquesne 6 days earlier. They only have the food and ammunition they can carry on their person. Yeah, after 6 days on the march, they're running out of food, and during this battle, they fire away all their ammunition. So De Villiers is in a bit of a pickle. As I mentioned earlier, his Native American allies, many of them are ready to go home. And De Villiers actually writes in his report, during the battle, they come to him and they say, hey buddy, we're out of here tomorrow. We don't care what's going on. So you better sort of wrap this thing up. For the most part, American Indians don't like being in static positions, especially during combat. They don't like sieges. They like to sort of those hit and run tactics where we sort of fight and go. And so being here for a long period of time, they're not all about that. And so De Villiers got problems. But as I mentioned, he's a better poker player than Washington. And during the negotiations, he's going to bluff him. And actually, De Villiers says, I'm having trouble controlling my Indians. Now, he's not lying. The Indians are leaving, right? They don't want anything to do with being here. But what does Washington take that to mean?
Massacre.
Yeah, a whole bunch of American Indian allies are going to come running out of the woods and slaughter his drunk soldiers that can't shoot back, and not only get all his soldiers right, maybe get old GW too. Self-preservation kicks in a little bit. So Washington tries to make the best of a really bad situation. He's going to get out of here alive with most of his men. He's going to be able to go back to Virginia. And so Washington is convinced to sign the surrender document. Somewhere around midnight, July 3rd and July 4th, Washington will sign the surrender. At dawn on July 4th, the French regulars will march down to the opening in the stockade, right where we have those two signs today. They will actually line up on either side, and the British regulars and Virginians march out and go back to Virginia. So again, Washington suffers casualties here. What we know outright, 30 men dead, 70 wounded. Many of those wounded men will die later. Washington would have a pretty harrowing march. Again, no food, no transportation. What's one of the first things the French and Indians do when they arrive here at the battlefield? Anybody look in our diorama?
Kill livestock.
They killed all the animals. They killed the horses and the cattle and the oxen. Why did they do that? Yeah, the British now have no food and no transportation. So even if the British had won here, the campaign is dead in the water. But yeah, so all the men have to sort of carry everything again. They have to carry the wounded, help the wounded along as best they can. But there's a morning report done on July 9th back in Cumberland at Wills Creek. And of all the wounded, over half of them say lame, left on the road. So many of those men died as well. The French suffer casualties. How many we don't know. De Villiers writes that there were 3 dead and 17 wounded. There's another account that says over 70. We don't know for sure. Again, the French counts vary. But again, this is a battlefield. And it's also to a certain extent a graveyard. What we know of those British casualties, the 30 dead at least here, they were buried to a certain extent where they fell. They had just dug these shallow trenches in the day before. Bodies were most likely pushed into those shallow graves and covered with earth. And in all our archaeology here, we've never found any human remains. So those men are still out here. And actually, Braddock's army, when they marched through the next year, along that same route we walked along today, they looked out into the meadow, and several of the officers in their journals noted human remains scattered about the field. So those men are still out there. And that's sort of how we want to end the program today. We are here at 3 o'clock going to hold a memorial service of sorts down at the fort, where we'll read the names, those names of the men we know were killed here, and then have a little firing of the cannon to salute. And so I would encourage you guys at 3 o'clock if you'd like to go down and participate in that program. So at this time, are there any questions? Anybody have any questions at all of me? Anything that I didn't cover that you're interested in?
Whatever happened to the reinforcements?
Yeah, that's a great question. So 2 British independent companies, so 200 British regulars, had arrived from New York almost 3 weeks previous. They never made it out of Alexandria. So they weren't the 2 best units in the British Army. They found, I guess, a few taverns along King Street that they liked and decided to hang out there. So, and then the rest of the provincial reinforcements from North Carolina actually never make it really beyond Winchester. They will get to Wills Creek a couple weeks after the battle was over. But yeah, they're well to the east. Yeah. So.
Is it true that the document George Washington signed was interpreted by Jumonville's brother, and he couldn't understand it, George Washington, and he was signing, and he did in fact kill?
Yeah, so Washington signs the surrender document, and it does, there's one word in there, assassin, so, what assassination means. There's a mistranslation in that. Washington's interpreter is Captain von Braun, who's a Dutchman. His first primary language is Dutch. His secondary language is English. His third language is French. He actually was not the primary interpreter. There's a French officer in Washington's aide, Captain Peroni, who's a French Huguenot, speaks French. He had been wounded during the engagement. So von Braun's got to translate this document. And he's got to, it's written down on a piece of paper in this soaking wet woods. He's got to then take that piece of paper back to the fort. By the time he gets in there, right, it's probably soaking wet. And so Captain von Braun, unfortunately for him, is going to have to sort of remember what was said. And not only is he going to have to remember what was said, in his head, it's going to have to go from French to English to Dutch. And something's going to get lost in translation. And that's what assassin means. Washington and the other officers take it to mean that Jumonville had died, that they had caused the death of Jumonville. The way it's written says he was murdered. Different connotations, especially diplomatically. And Captain von Braun, by the way, is going to go right under the bus for that. Washington will throw him directly under the bus. So it doesn't work out very well for him. Another question?
They showed up around 9, and by 11 they were dispersing. What time did it first start to rain about?
So it's raining throughout the morning. I think, we don't have sort of specifics on the weather. We just know that it's a very wet day. And then the only real specifics we have is later in the afternoon, about 2 or 3 o'clock, when you get that torrential sort of downpour.
I'm just curious why Washington didn't send law enforcement up into the woods, like actually even Braddock.
Right, yeah.
Colonials
Sort of,
did
yeah.
anyway.
Right.
Is that
Sort of have a
something
screen
that
out.
Wasn't in their military
No. Yeah.
minds
Yeah.
yet?
No. Yeah, Washington, again, I think he's pretty well experienced to lead this expedition, but is he that well versed tactically? No, and it's really not something in the British Army. That's even something Braddock is lampooned, but that's innovative on Braddock's account. Yeah. Any other questions at all? Well, I'll be hanging out here if you have any individually you want to ask, but I'd encourage you to go down and check out our memorial program. But thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you guys coming along and braving the sun and the ticks. But pleasure having you along. So thank you very much. Yeah. Round of applause for Casey.